day 6 of 30, and there's two things I want to talk about. One, what you're seeing on the board. I feel like right now things are changing so quickly that nobody is really an expert in the best way to approach things. There's things that are working for certain people, there's things that feel like they're best practice, but really the pace of improvement and the pace of change is so radical right now that all of the things that we take for granted right now as best practice might get proven as something that's completely wrong in the future. And I'll talk a bit about an example of this, but things are changing so quickly. So many different types of documentation even that you might be using to build a project aren't catching up to the stuff that's being put out there, particularly where some of the frameworks that you might be using are built on foundational models and it takes time to sort of catch up from their perspective. But the second thing I wanted to talk about is getting a bit more into the detail and talking through some of the things around maintaining consistency in inputs and outputs and the importance of that throughout a workflow. And I think this is going to become more and more important as we start to build these more complex workflows. And I'll go through a super simple example and then I'll talk about how we can ensure consistency and what the scenarios in which you might want that and might not want that are as well. But let's just take something super simple. Then we'll compare it to normal functions and normal math there. So let's say with a normal function, you might have something like a multi-step workflow as well. And you might always know that step 1 is always going to be 1 plus 1 equals 2. So the output from step 1 is always supposed to be 2. And then you might have a second step which takes 5 to the power of whatever comes out of step 1. And then your final step might require 25 as the output. Now, when you're using just straight up math, you can be pretty certain, unless there's an error, that this output is always going to be 2, because this is never changing. Where this becomes a bit funky with agent is that because we're using prompts, there's a likelihood that 1 plus 1 is 2, but there's always some very small chance that it's not. And when you're working with complex systems and you have potentially many millions of users, this becomes a real issue. You need to be really certain that the output from here is going to match what the next step in a process is expecting. And this isn't a new problem, but it's just something that has become more brought to the front more because of these AI models and the way that they work. So I'll go through a super simple example here and bring to life something that I was playing with today. So let's say I've got a multi-step workflow, just as we've been talking about recently. So I've got step 1, I've got step 2, let's say I've got step 3 as well. And we'll just have a super linear thing, and we could maybe even have some branching here. And this condition goes to step 4, and this goes to step 5. And then we could also have certain loops and things like this we've seen before, particularly with these complex workflows. So you have your input, goes through a process, maybe this is a create step, maybe this is a review step, and maybe this is a summarize step. Now, one thing that we need to be really sure of is that the inputs to step 1 are meeting the expectation for what we're trying to do in step 1. The outputs of step 1 should be meeting the requirements that we may have for step 2, and if we're bringing in additional data, all of that meets what we need for that step. And I'll the mental model I like to use for this is just zooming in on step 1 for a second here, is you can have these filters on either side of the step to make sure that the structure of data is meeting what you're expecting. So we've got one filter on this side, this is your in, one filter on that side, this is your out. Now these are schemas that define the shape of your data, essentially saying that we're expecting this to have 5 fields as inputs, maybe 3 of them are numbers, maybe 2 of them are text. As a very simple example, we can get much more detailed and say this is going to be chosen from a drop-down list or something like that as well. But we've got some filters that will say, unless the stuff that is coming in here meets this criteria, I'm going to reject it, and I'm going to cancel that out, and I'm going to stop the process here. But if it meets the criteria, happy days, we can move on. And we can have something similar on the outside as well. If the outputs from step 1 don't meet what we're expecting, we can go ahead and reject this here. And if it meets what we need, then happy days, it can move on. It can go on to step 2 and sort of down the chain. Now, the reason this is really powerful is because instead of having to wait until getting to all the way to step 5, if there's an issue with our create step, and this is the exact issue that I had today, is that we had the inputs coming in as expected, but for some reason we couldn't just get the outputs in the exact format that I needed for the subsequent step. So what we're able to do is build in some checks and things like that to make sure that if there's any issues here, we see it here instead of way down here, which allows for much better debugging. It also allows you to change things more iteratively, and then also see what the downstream impacts of certain improvements that you might be making are. And the other thing is that within each step, it doesn't just have to be a agentic or a model that's doing some of the thinking. This could also be some functions, just normal if-then type stuff. If we get an image coming in, we might have an agent that deals with that. If we have a PDF coming in, you might have a different agent that deals with that. And we can just have a normal function which determines which of those gets activated in each of those different scenarios. And then, of course, you can then still try to get to the same output and still drive consistency further down the system while still maintaining some those checks throughout the process. A lot of this is enabled by using TypeScript and having schemas for each of these different steps for inputs and outputs, but that's really an implementation detail. What we're trying to do here is make sure that we've got some predictability on the different steps in the process, so then we can really pinpoint where the bigger issues are coming from and the biggest opportunities for improvement. A bit more work for me to do on this part here, but I think we're getting a real good idea of the shape of the system that we want to be producing. So it's really exciting. And if you want to see what we're up to tomorrow, I've got a call with a potential pilot or customer, reconnecting with somebody else in my network who could also be a potential person that we're working with in the future. I think we'll be able to figure something out in both scenarios. So very excited for those. And if you want to keep following along, just follow along. See you tomorrow.